Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
Okay, thank you for the confirmation. Yes, as I already introduced, my name is Mekides, and I am assistant professor here in Monsell Color Science Laboratory in Rochester, New York. So today I will be presenting the CIE-TC 818 work in general. And as a technical committee chair, I will briefly introduce the progress and also maybe try to explain a little more in detail the technical report that we are preparing. So to just introduce the TC, the CIE-TC 818, we have 26 members as if now the current TC members. The committee actually tries to work with different committees in ISO as well as ICC and CIE organizations which are working on high dynamic range image related works. Because as you already have been listening today from our previous presenters, there have been a lot of HDR related works in a very different standardization work and in different standard organizations. So it's in particular important for our TC to really follow up the current updates, because the main goal of this TC 818 is actually because this HDR is kind of new. There are a lot of developments every day, every year, so it might be a bit confusing for newcomers, and there are different standards, different terminologies, different formats being introduced every month, every year. So the main goal of this TC 818 is kind of to avoid this confusion for the newcomers and kind of generate a one document which will explain what high dynamic range image and sequence are and what is available out there. Can we move to the next slide? So the technical committee, the title is actually the guidelines for definition and evaluation of high dynamic range image and sequences. So the general goal is to actually identify important terms related to high dynamic range image and image sequences, and basically the most importantly identifying those typical characteristics which actually differentiate HDR from those of their SDR counterparts, and characterize or explain those characteristics with a clear definition without any ambiguity. And also we may need to present how to measure them and physically and perceptually. So in general, we are working towards generating a general document which have a general definition and guidelines to really help clarify common misconceptions and confusions in high dynamic range imaging in general. And the scope, we identified 3 scopes. First, we decided to do key terminology identifications related to high dynamic range image and defining them. And then we identified to really assess and identify the characteristics of HDR content which will distinctively separate or differentiate HDR from SDR content. And finally, we decided to also include how are we going to measure these characteristics in physical measurement using measurement devices as well as perceptually. Next slide. So for the past 4 or 5 years, we have been discussing all these objective. According to the objective, we have been discussing a lot of HDR related terms, characteristics, and definitions with a lot of meetings with our TC members. And we decided that we already started writing the technical report for this TC. And we kind of structured the technical report to have these major components. First, we will have those terms and definitions that we have identified and selected that to be important, that should be included with a clear terms, definitions, which are recommended by our TC members. And then we have a bigger section in the technical report, which basically covers the CIE high dynamic range framework, because we needed the high dynamic range imaging pipeline related framework so that we can identify each characteristics of high dynamic range imaging sequences based on the pipeline stages. And then in detail, we will explain those characteristics all related to this framework. And then after that, we will have a special section, shorter section on how current works are addressing color in high dynamic range imaging in general. And then finally, the perceptual physical measurements of the HDR characteristics identified will be covered, and recommendations will be given from on this technical report. Yeah, so now I will go one by one that what is in these structures in the technical report. That in the beginning there will be terms and definitions. So as I mentioned, we have done a selection of these terms and definitions from a huge survey that we made on existing HDR related standards from ISO standard, SMTE, and ICC, CIE, and lighting from different standard organizations, and also literature reviews. We were able to identify very important terms that we think are confusing for example, for newcomers, and also like even for experts. Sometimes some of these words have been defined in different ways in different standards. So even in our survey, we were able to see that the same term could be defined in completely different ways and in conflicting ways in different standards. So we have identified some of the very important terms from all this list of terms, and then the TC have been discussing on them for a long time, and then we kind of proposed our recommended definitions in the technical report. But yeah, still the final definitions are under review. It's not finished, but we kind of almost done with this section. Next slide. Yes, and the next important part of the terms of the technical report is the high dynamic range framework, because it's here where we will be explaining really how high dynamic range come into today's standards, starting from the very short history of HDR imaging, starting from the film photography from the Ansel Adams times, and then high dynamic range. We will delve into the identification of those characteristics of what high dynamic range image or image sequence means compared to the SDR ones. So these characteristics are really different when we talk about the different stages of high dynamic range pipeline. For example, if we are talking about the physical scene, so the physical scene itself has its own defining characteristics. And then when we talk about acquisition, so the instrument we use for acquisition of the HDR, the HDR scene, it has its own characteristics, which would be defining its innate high dynamic range properties. And then, as we heard today, there are so many formats, HDR formats being proposed, which are used for transmission, broadcasting, and also storage, archiving purposes. So we will be also covering on those formats, kind of summarizing them, and then we will see it later. But we find that they have their own characteristics, they have their own, defining properties that needs to be separately defined on that stage. And then when we talk about display, as Timo already mentioned, some of the displays are the display aspect. Display is completely different than the camera. So the HDR characteristics when they are HDR image sequences, when they are rendered on the display, they might need more additional features and properties need to be considered in order to properly define them. Next slide. So just to mention the briefly in the HDR framework, what it will contain is brief history already has been done, a survey starting from the Ansel Adams zone system, which is usually, today's similar. It's a similar process with today's tone mapping process, you could say. And then the Technicolor 3-strip process to create a 3-channel image on different exposures on different film with a beam splitter, which also help increase the gamut as well as the dynamic range. And then after that, how we come into exposure fusion, kind of digital solutions in photography and video processing. And then we move on to today's display technology, starting from CRT, and then the bit dubs progress based on the technology from 8-bit to 16-bit now, maybe more with today's technology. And then also the standard, starting from the CRT-based BT709, less resolution standards to today's BT2100 high resolution standards. Next, please. Then after the history, we will start talking about key characteristics, and we have already discussed a lot of those characteristics. For example, dynamic range was our big discussion in the TC committee, because dynamic range by itself could be defined in different ways depending on which application we are considering. And when it is in the scene, when it's in the camera, when it's in the display, how are we defining dynamic range and its relationship, for example, with the other characteristics like contrast, beat depth, and tonal range. All these, these terms are very confusing, so it took us a long time to understand each other, to learn from each other and come up with a kind of generalized recommended definition, measurement, and perceptual and physical measurement of a dynamic range. But then in high dynamic range, once we define dynamic range, what is really separating low dynamic range from high dynamic range content, especially when we talk about high dynamic range image and videos applications. In that case, there was like a lot of discussion, because we cannot really determine come up with a threshold to say that after 100 candela per meter square, it should be HDR, or lower than that, it should be SDR. Even though there are some standards defining high dynamic range content like that, but in our TC, we have discussed a lot on this, and we come up with this recommendation, which says that high dynamic range content should have these key characteristics. One is expanded luminance range, of course, which is higher than the SDR, and like the range, that means it also include the minimum luminance and maximum luminance capability, and the bit depth for giving more more tonal range and also avoiding quantizations when we have high dynamic or higher luminance range content represented. And then we feel that these other two characteristics, which is floating adaptation and self-luminous contents, are found to be very important, which will specifically differentiate high dynamic range content from SDR content. If you remember, like Timo's presentation today has a lot of scenes with a lot of emissive contents in the HDR example image he was showing. Those are self-luminous colors. Even in HDR displays, you can really see the distinction when you have only diffuse contents and when you have self-luminous contents. The HDR aspect of it is more apparent when you have that type of content. And the floating adaptation is also mentioned a little bit with Timo's presentation, which is like because HDR is a bit different than SDR because highly affected with adaptation luminance, the scene luminance, and as well as the surrounding luminance labels. So, and our adaptation level also, and for the camera, also for the human visual system, based on our adaptation, the appearance overall would be affected. So this floating adaptation, self-luminous, high peak depths, expanded luminance range is very important. Next slide, please. So just like this, HDR content should be specifically identified, and the characteristics needs to be identified. And then we say that the whole imaging pipeline, which will related to processing such contents, it includes the tone mapping as well as the reverse tone mapping aspect of it. We define that as an high dynamic range imaging. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just more examples for key characteristics. In addition to dynamic range, we consider flare, glare, contrast, and also diffuse and reference white. For example, today it have been headroom was presented earlier, which is really very important because the difference between diffuse and the headroom, how does it really affect the representation of high dynamic range contents from SDR contents. That is also what we are exploring right now to have a proper definition and experiment and examples to show how really that differentiate HDR from the SDR. Next slide. Yeah, I think after this, I just go in each stage by stage and defining the different measurement, perceptual and instrumental measurement, as well as the characteristics. So we can proceed to next slide. And the file format, which have been explained today also, most of them are mentioned, like the scene referred, the display referred, and also the newly introduced the gain map file formats. We would really want to explore these file formats when it comes to defining really those key characteristics of HDR image and image sequences. So we will have a bigger section in our terms of reference discussing these formats as well. Next slide. And then when it comes to the display, we also have a lot of measurement and characterization standards which are proposed for display as well, from SMTE, VISA, and also ABU, and also ISO. There are lots of standards that we are currently doing a survey on to include into our technical report. Next slide, please. And when it comes to color in HDR, as everybody knows, there are lots of color spaces and color appearance models being prepared. So we feel like this needs to be explored, especially for considering the tone mapping and reverse tone mapping application. As Timo and other presenters say that we need the gamut mapping, like a gamut volume mapping, than just a normal gamma type of tone mapping, because when we have a big volume, and as I already mentioned, this luminance and chroma information represented in different color spaces the channel independence, hue linearity, and other luminance-related color appearance models, if they are not properly handled, it will actually create, it won't create an accurate appearance reproduction when we include them in different imaging pipelines. So in this technical report, we would like to explore these limitations, and we will not propose a new color appearance model color spaces, but we would like to explore and show the limitations and maybe propose new research topics maybe for future CIE technical committee or other researchers interested in doing high dynamic range studies. Yeah, so as you can see here, we are already almost at the last stage of the CIE-TC committee work. So we are planning to finish our technical report maybe a third quarter of next year, 2026. Thank you for your attention.